Canal, Wisno.
Nox Massasoid.
Forebears was dying, and he wanted the men around him to understand exactly what the disease had taken. He was a Mandan chief, painted for war his whole life, respected by traders and rivals alike. Now his face was one open wound. He told the men at his bedside that he did not fear death. What he feared was dying with his face rotten, so disfigured that even wolves would flinch at the sight of him. That was the summer of 1837 at Fort Clark on the upper Missouri River. Within weeks, his entire village would be almost gone. But this isn't a story about a cure. There wasn't one. No plant, no ceremony, no healer anywhere in North America could stop the virus once it was in a person's blood. What actually decided who lived and who died was something quieter than medicine. Warning, distance. A body of knowledge that some communities had spent 200 years building, while others never got the chance to build it at all. Smallpox is a brutal piece of biology on its own terms. It spreads through the air, through coughing, through the fluid in the sores it raises across the skin. Once someone is infected, there is nothing to do. Just wait, roughly a month, while the disease runs its course on its own terms. In a population that has never met the virus before, historians put the death rate somewhere between 30% and 70% of everyone infected. Survivors were often left blind. Their skin carried pitted scars for the rest of their lives. And every single person living in the Americas fell into that first, most vulnerable category, because smallpox had never existed on this continent before European ships carried it across the ocean. Look closer at what the disease actually did to a body, and the scale of the problem gets even clearer. The first days feel like a bad flu, fever, aching joints, a headache that won't ease. Then the rash arrives, first in the mouth and throat, then across the face, arms and torso, hardening over about a week into raised, fluid-filled lesions packed so densely in severe cases that the skin barely shows between them. Eating became difficult, then nearly impossible, as the lesions spread across the mouth and throat themselves, which is part of why so many victims died weakened by dehydration and hunger on top of the disease itself. For roughly 2 more weeks, the sores blister, weep, scab, and finally fall away, leaving the deep, pitted, scarring survivors carried for life. Some were left blind, some lost fingers or the use of a limb to secondary infection. Nothing in any culture, anywhere on Earth, reliably stopped that progression once it started, and nothing would for another 200 years, until the vaccine finally arrived. That absence of prior exposure is the whole tragedy in miniature. Old world populations had lived alongside smallpox, measles and influenza for thousands of years, generation after generation, surviving and passing down partial resistance. Indigenous nations in North and South America had no such history with this particular family of disease. When it arrived, it didn't meet an immune system with any memory of the fight. It met a body meeting the enemy for the first time, and it moved through entire nations the way a fire moves through dry grass. By the time it reached the Mandan villages in 1837, it had already been through this continent more than once, and each pass was its own catastrophe. In 1520, an outbreak swept into the Valley of Mexico behind Spanish forces retreating from Tenochtitlan, and it killed the Aztec emperor Cuitlahuac within months of his taking the throne. Historians studying that outbreak believe it killed a substantial share of the city's population before the Spanish returned to finish the conquest, a devastation that reshaped the balance of power in the region as much as any battle did. A century later, an epidemic moving through the coast of New England around 1616 to 1619 hit Wampanoag communities so hard that entire villages emptied out, including Patuxet, the home village of the man English colonists would later know as Squanto. When the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620, they built their colony on ground that had been a thriving town only a year or two earlier, a ghost town, essentially, handed to them empty. Every one of these waves stripped away not just people, but the people who carried the community's knowledge forward, the elders who knew when to plant, where to hunt in a hard winter, how to read the river. When a village lost most of its old people in a single season, it didn't just grieve, it lost the instructions for surviving the next hard year, which made it weaker heading into whatever came next. Fort Clark showed what that erosion looked like at its worst. The Mandan had lived along the Missouri for generations in fortified villages, farming corn and squash, trading with tribes, and with the fur companies moving up and down the river. The disease is generally traced to the steamboat street, Peters, which carried supplies, traders, and at least one infected passenger up the Missouri that spring, stopping at posts along the way before reaching the villages near Fort Clark. Before that summer, the Mandan population is estimated at around 1,600 people. By the time the epidemic burned out, historians place the number of survivors at somewhere close to 100 to 150, roughly 1 in 10. Neighboring nations, including the Hidatsa, the Arikara, the Crow, the Blackfeet, and the Assiniboine were hit hard as well, carried along the same river trade that had brought steamboats, furs, and now disease deeper into the continent than any earlier outbreak had reached. Grief on that scale broke people in ways that went beyond the physical illness itself. Accounts from the period describe men and women who could not bear to be seen disfigured, and some took their own lives rather than live marked by the disease. In a handful of documented cases, even choosing to end their children's suffering along with their own. Whole extended families disappeared from the historical record within the same few weeks. Gone, almost overnight. It is one of the darkest chapters in the entire history of the American West, and outside a handful of historians who specialize in it, almost nobody ever hears the name Fort Clark at all. That fear forebears spoke about at the start wasn't unique to him. Among the Mandan and several neighboring nations, there was a belief that however the body looked at the moment of death was how it would appear in the afterlife. A disfigured death meant an eternity spent disfigured, worse than dying. It became a threat to how a person would exist forever. That belief helps explain why some survivors, after watching their families die covered in scars they could never speak about, chose to end their own lives rather than live marked that way, and in the darkest documented cases, took their children with them rather than leave them to face the same fate alone. Understanding that belief doesn't make the loss any smaller. It just makes clear how completely the disease attacked not only bodies, but the entire framework people used to make sense of death itself. Here's the part of the story that rarely makes it into the same conversation as Fort Clark. Roughly a century earlier, in the towns of the Cherokee and Creek people in the southeast, something else entirely had been worked out. Historian Paul Kelton spent years studying how these nations responded to repeated smallpox outbreaks across the 1700s, and his research pushes back hard against the old assumption that native communities simply had no defense against European disease. The Cherokee took their existing Great New Moon Festival, known as the Ahtawhhungnah, and adapted it specifically to hold off contagious disease. Held every year after the season's first new moon, it brought people together to purify themselves through herbal medicine and ritual bathing. But underneath the religious language, it also functioned as organized distancing. Villages that had already been exposed stayed apart from villages that hadn't, and the shared ceremony gave that separation a form people could recognize and trust, rather than treating it as abandonment. The Creek ran a parallel version of the same idea, called the Tsotí bene, built around the same core logic of keeping the sick and the healthy apart until a wave had passed. Strip away the ceremony and the mechanism is plain. Quarantine, dressed in ritual clothing. Kelton's research argues it measurably slowed the spread and cut the death toll in these communities, compared to nations caught with no plan at all. Spiritual leaders who organized these responses didn't just save lives in the moment. They reinforced their own standing and their community's trust in tribal custom at exactly the point where colonizers assumed that trust should have been collapsing. That distinction matters because it reframes the whole question. This was never about whether indigenous medicine could beat a virus head-on. No medicine anywhere on Earth could do that until Edward Jenner's vaccine appeared at the tail end of the 1700s. The real question is different. Had a community built the social machinery to slow the disease down long enough for fewer people to catch it in the first place? Some had generations before contact with any European doctor. Others hadn't, often because repeated waves of earlier epidemics, warfare, and forced relocation had already shattered the social structures that made that kind of coordinated response possible. Further north, on the plains, communities built their own version of the same instinct, even without a fixed agricultural calendar to organize it around. Northern Plains groups used what accounts from the period describe as drum and rattle ceremonies, meant both to strengthen a community's will to endure an outbreak and to mark which camps were sick so others would keep their distance. The Gros Ventre held what was recorded as the squaw dance, aimed at driving off the dangerous forces they believed were carrying the sickness toward their people. Southeastern nations went further still, actively avoiding villages known to be infected and passing warnings to travelers before they wandered into a sick town without knowing it. None of these practices touched the virus directly. All of them functioned as early warning systems, built out of the only tools available at the time: word of mouth, ceremony, and a shared understanding that distance saved lives. Away from the ceremonies, people also treated the symptoms directly, with mixed results historians still argue about today. In the Hudson Bay region, during the 1782 to 1783 outbreak, Cree healers used bear oil as an emetic, meant to induce vomiting and, in their understanding, purge the sickness from the body. And by that point, some communities in the area were also blending indigenous treatments with medicinal techniques picked up from European traders they dealt with regularly. Other communities leaned on steam and sweat lodges to bring on fever and force out whatever was making a person sick, treating the illness the same way they'd long treated other fevers. That particular practice is genuinely contested among historians. Some, including Jones, Starner, Taylor, and Axtell, argue that intense heat and induced sweating likely worsened dehydration in patients already losing fluid through fever and weeping sores, which may have raised the death toll rather than lowering it. Kelton takes the opposing view, arguing that in many documented cases, the overall pattern of response, sweat practices included, still came out ahead of doing nothing at all. Neither side claims these treatments cured any one of the virus itself. What both sides actually agree on, once you read past the disagreement, is that quarantine and avoidance, not any medicine or ritual, is where the real reduction in deaths came from. By the later 1700s, that quarantine instinct had sharpened into something close to formal protocol in several regions. Infected people were physically separated from the rest of the community, often moved to a separate lodge outside the main village, where only a small number of caretakers had contact with them. Homes where someone had died were sometimes burned outright, and where they weren't burned, they were thoroughly cleaned before anyone else was allowed inside. Runners moved between towns specifically to warn neighboring villages which settlements were sick, so hunting parties and traders could route around them entirely rather than carrying the disease onward without knowing it. Travelers, coming from unfamiliar territory, were sometimes held at a distance and questioned before being allowed near a town's food stores or its children. Trade itself slowed in the middle of an active outbreak, even at real economic cost, because the alternative risked losing far more than a season's furs. None of it stopped the virus once it had a foothold in a body, but timing mattered. All of it, done early and done consistently, could be the difference between a single sick traveler and a village-wide catastrophe. There's a darker piece of this history that has to sit alongside the rest, because it shows how deliberately some of that hard-won protection got undermined. At Fort Pitt, in 1763, during Pontiac's War, a British officer named Simeon Equier gave blankets and a handkerchief taken from the fort's smallpox hospital to representatives of the Lenape people negotiating nearby. Correspondence from British commanders at the time, including Geoffrey Amherst, shows the intent behind the act plainly stated to spread the disease among native populations as a weapon and Amherst's letters make clear he saw it as a legitimate tactic in a war he was determined to win by any available means. Historians still debate whether that specific exchange caused new infections, since smallpox was already moving through the region from other contact. The intent, though, is not in dispute. It stands as one of the earliest documented attempts at biological warfare on the continent, and a direct reminder that the same colonial expansion spreading the disease was, at times, actively working to make the outcome worse. Vaccination finally arrived, but late and unevenly. Edward Jenner published his findings on cowpox inoculation in 1798, and within a few years, the practice crossed the Atlantic. Thomas Jefferson personally vaccinated members of his own family and friends, more than 200 people in total, and he is credited as the first American official to have Native Americans vaccinated as part of a federal effort in the early 1800s. He even sent vaccine matter along with the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804, hoping the explorers could inoculate tribes they met along the way. By the time the party reached the plains, the doses had spoiled in the heat, and the vaccination never happened. A small, almost administrative failure that left an entire stretch of the Missouri exactly as exposed as it had always been. Decades later, in 1836 and 1837, British authorities used the same vaccine to try to blunt an outbreak moving through Puget Sound on that same stretch of coast where earlier generations had faced the disease with nothing but ceremony and distance. But access was never even... Many nations, especially those furthest from trading posts, forts, and federal agents, never saw a vaccine at all until long after their own outbreak had already run its course, and the Mandan at Fort Clark were among the communities the vaccine reached too late to matter. For them, and for dozens of nations like them, the only real tools left were the same ones other communities had spent 2 centuries refining: distance, isolation. Warning passed from one village to the next before the sickness could arrive unannounced. What actually got healed, in the end, wasn't the disease itself, it was the community. Survivors at Fort Clark rebuilt a village that had lost almost every elder it once had. The people who normally would have carried forward the exact songs, planting calendars, and hunting routes the Mandan had relied on for generations. Younger survivors had to reassemble that knowledge from fragments, from whoever happened to still be alive, and from whatever had already been shared before the epidemic hit. Some of that chain never fully recovered. Historians studying tribal record-keeping and oral history still find the gaps left by that single catastrophic season at Fort Clark, and dozens of outbreaks like it across the continent, missing details as small as a specific planting technique or as large as an entire ceremonial cycle. Nobody survived to perform again. Other nations, the ones whose warning networks and quarantine ceremonies held, walked into the next century with far more of their population, their leadership, and their traditions still intact, not because their medicine was stronger, but because their organization was. That same instinct never fully disappeared, and it resurfaced almost exactly 200 years after Fort Clark. During the COVID pandemic, tribal governments across the country leaned on strict isolation policies and curfews, and communities turned to traditional knowledge holders, the people who still carry ceremony, herbal practice, and community memory, as something close to first responders. Researchers who later interviewed knowledge holders across several Arizona nations found the same 3 threads running through nearly every account: a sense of responsibility to every living thing and the land itself, a careful blending of indigenous and outside medical systems rather than a rejection of one for the other, and a deliberate effort to keep cultural practice continuous even under lockdown. They ran ceremonies over phone calls and video calls, modified rituals to keep participants at a distance from each other and from shared objects like food, water, and instruments, and treated collective care as the entire point of the response rather than an afterthought bolted onto it. It's almost the same shape as the Ahtawhhungnah 300 years earlier, adapted again, this time to a virus nobody in 1730 could have imagined. So maybe the real question isn't how anyone healed smallpox. Nobody did. Plants didn't do it. Prayer didn't do it. Only a vaccine could. And it arrived generations too late for most of the people who needed it, spoiled in a saddlebag on the Missouri, or simply never sent at all. The real question is why some communities walked away from that century with their knowledge intact, and others were left rebuilding from almost nothing. Put the Cherokee towns that ran the Ahtawhhungnah next to the Mandan villages at Fort Clark, and you're not looking at two different levels of medicine, you're looking at two different levels of warning. One had a century of built-up practice for keeping the sick away from the healthy. The other had a steamboat dock, its infected passenger right at the center of town before anyone understood what was already moving through the crowd. It comes down to the same hard truth in both cases. The nations that survived best were the ones that had already learned, through repeated and devastating trial, that the fight was never against the virus itself. It was against how fast it could move, and who was left standing to slow it down. If you want to see how much of that knowledge survived, and how it's being used again right now, that's a story that's still being written.